Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the nature and sources of the UK Constitution in A-level politics. So that's not just all the knowledge you need to know, including specific examples, but also some key points of analysis and the key essay questions you could get asked in the exam so that you can be fully prepared. I'm going to start by going through the parts of the specification this video covers and the key potential essay questions and key debates you could get asked about. From there, I'm going to look at the nature of the UK Constitution, looking at how it's uncodified, unentrenched, unitary, and kind of the twin pillars of the UK Constitution of parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. From there, I'm going to go into the historical development of the UK Constitution, looking at 7 key historical documents that have really developed the Constitution are really key to understanding it. And then finally, I'm going to look at the 5 main sources of the UK Constitution. So looking at treaties, statute law, authoritative texts, common law and conventions, and how these are really important to the UK Constitution. Before finally looking at a couple of recent developments to the Constitution and some key constitutional issues. So yeah, the PDF you should be seeing up there, you can find if you go on the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also find a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, as well as a lot of resources, paid and free, to help you in your A-level politics so that you can be fully prepared for this year's exams. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers. So this is the first part of the UK government part of the A-level Edexcel A-level politics course, and it's the first part of the constitution topic. So it's looking at the nature and sources of the UK Constitution, including an overview of its development through key historical documents, the nature of the Constitution, and the 5 main sources of the UK Constitution. In terms of key debates and essay questions you could get on this topic in the exam, it's very unlikely that there will be an essay question just on this content alone, but understanding the concept in this lesson is crucial to being able to answer questions that incorporate later topics as well. So later parts of the Constitution topics, such as recent developments and debates over codification, as well as other parts of the UK government syllabus, such as in the relations between branches topic on kind of the Supreme Court and on sovereignty. So even though there won't necessarily be a question just on this topic, there can be these questions which knowing the content of this topic is really important in being able to answer them. And to give you a couple of ideas of what they might be, it could be evaluate the view that there are more advantages to having a codified constitution than remaining with an uncodified constitution. So you need to know about the current constitution, right? How it's uncodified in order to answer that. Evaluate the view that Parliament is still sovereign. So you need to know a lot about parliamentary sovereignty. And evaluate the extent to which the UK is now effectively a federal system. So to know that, you need to know how it didn't used to be a federal system, right? So yeah, that's everything in terms of the parts of the specification and key essay questions. I'm going to start by looking at the nature of the UK Constitution. So the first key thing in relation to the nature of the UK Constitution is that it's uncodified. So what does that mean? The UK Constitution is said to be uncodified, as unlike in the US, it isn't written down in a single document. While some parts of it are written down, such as treaties, and we'll see this kind of nearer to the end of the video, other parts are unwritten. And therefore, unlike the US, which is in one key single document, everyone knows it, that isn't the case in the UK. It's in lots of different sources. Also, in comparison to the US, or as a difference to the US, the UK Constitution is unentrenched. So unlike in the US, where it's very difficult to change the Constitution, so I think supermajorities are required from both the Senate, the House of Representatives and states, the UK Constitution can be changed with a simple majority in Parliament, so just as if it's a normal act of Parliament. The Constitution therefore isn't different to normal laws, or kind of doesn't have a higher status or extra protections, and it can be really easily changed and is very flexible as a consequence of that. So both flexible but also vulnerable. Another key way or key kind of way to understand the UK Constitution is that it's unitary. So the British Constitution has always been said to be unitary because power was centralised in just one place, UK Parliament, which was sovereign. However, kind of more recently, in recent decades, especially since devolution, there have been questions around whether this is still the case and whether the UK Constitution and the UK state and kind of political structure can still be said to be unitary. Some argue that the UK Constitution is still unitary, as the UK Parliament has handed power to the devolved bodies, but can also take it away when they want, and it therefore retains legal sovereignty and is still kind of the only or kind of really kind of central and key lawmaking body in Britain. Others, however, argue that the UK constitution is no longer unitary, and Britain now is now a union state or quasi-federal, because the power has been permanently devolved, and it would be very difficult to revoke. So even if you have this kind of theoretical legal sovereignty, there's questions about whether that legal sovereignty of Parliament is still in place. But B, even if it's agreed there is that legal sovereignty, would it really be politically practical for the UK Parliament to just get rid of the Scottish Parliament now? Probably not. And therefore, can we kind of think about whether it's moved away from being unitary? The final two key ways to understand the nature of the UK Constitution are known as the twin pillars of the UK Constitution. And that's because A.V. Dicey, who is a key constitutional theorist, coined these as the two twin pillars of the UK Constitution in 1885. And these are parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. So similar to it being unitary, right? Parliamentary sovereignty refers to the fact that the UK Parliament is sovereign within the UK Constitution. And what does that mean? So it means that it is the key lawmaking body and amending body in Britain. So when Dicey was writing, it was the only lawmaking and amending body in Britain, right? Because we've got devolved parliaments now. But the UK Parliament is pretty difficult to argue against this. The UK Parliament is still the key lawmaking and amending body in the country. Crucially, it can also make laws on any subject, including making changes to the Constitution. It cannot bind its successors nor be bound by its predecessors. So that means that kind of a Parliament can't pass a law which stops a future Parliament doing something, right? That future Parliament can just turn around and change the law, right, and say no. And crucial for understanding the Constitution is that means that no law, including constitutional laws, can be entrenched. So if a previous Parliament said you need a supermajority in order to change this law, that can't really happen, right? Because the next Parliament can just pass an act of Parliament with a simple majority, revoking that need for a supermajority, and therefore, like, Parliament can't bind its successors or be bound by its predecessors. And then finally, no court or higher body, including the Supreme Court, can strike down a law passed by Parliament. This wasn't the case when Britain was in the EU, crucially, as the European Court of Justice could do so, and the Supreme Court in the UK kind of helped to do so as well in applying those EU laws in the UK. But now it's kind of gone back to when A.V. Dicey was writing, and kind of the strengthening of parliamentary sovereignty again, as there isn't that ability for the Supreme Court to strike down a law passed by Parliament anymore because we're not in the EU and there isn't that kind of higher law which the EU represents. So that's parliamentary sovereignty. The second twin pillar of the UK Constitution is the rule of law. And key to the rule of law is the idea that nobody is above the law and everybody has to obey it. So this applies to all people and all bodies, crucially including politicians, judges and government officials who aren't above the law, and therefore the law is supposed to treat everyone as equal. Of course, there's practical limits to that, especially we can see in relation to discrimination in a lot of areas, but theoretically the law does treat everyone as equal. Further, everyone has the right to a fair trial and to know their charges, and judges must be neutral and free from political interference, which is ensured by being well paid and difficult to sack. So yeah, they're the key ways to describe and to understand the nature of the UK Constitution. One little final thing that's often used to describe the UK Constitution is known as the Westminster model. So the Westminster model is used to describe a form of constitution and government based on the British political system. So you have these kind of, the Westminster model is used in different parts of the world, and it includes the following elements: parliamentary sovereignty, the fusion of the executive and the legislature. So all members of the government are members of Parliament and accountable to Parliament, and that differs, for example, from the US, where members of government, the president being the key example, isn't in the House of Representatives or the Senate. And finally, political power is centralised. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the nature of the UK Constitution. What I'm going to go through next is the historical development of the Constitution. So there are 7 key historical documents that are really useful to understanding this historical development, and were really important to this development of the UK Constitution. The first of those is the Magna Carta, which was passed in 1215, and this set out for the first time the principle that no one should be deprived of liberty and property without the due process of law. And it was therefore important in what later became the rule of law, and was a key kind of development that started that process. The next one, quite a bit later, is the Bill of Rights in 1689, and this included provisions for regular parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech within Parliament. and it was therefore important towards a move towards parliamentary sovereignty and away from divine right and the power of the monarch. Just over a decade later, you have the 1701 Act of Settlement, which established the right of Parliament to determine the line of succession to the throne. This was further kind of moving the power away from the monarch and to Parliament, and yeah, kind of really continuing that move towards parliamentary sovereignty. Just 6 years later, you had the 1707 Acts of Union, and this united England and Scotland under one parliament in Westminster. So previously, you'd had a Scottish parliament and a UK, an English parliament, with representatives in those different parliaments. Now you had a UK parliament with representatives from both countries, and this therefore increased the centralisation of power in the UK constitution and in just UK parliament, and of course increased that parliamentary sovereignty as well. Then in the 20th century, you have two key acts, which were both the Parliament's acts. So the 1911 Act set out that the House of Lords couldn't delay money bills and only had a 2-year delaying power for other bills, rather than the veto they'd previously had. So the House of Lords used to be equal with the House of Commons in terms of power, and if one of them didn't consent to passing a bill, then it wouldn't get passed, right? But after this 1911 Parliaments Act, it decreased the power of the House of Lords by removing that veto they had, and replaced it with a delaying power. So after those 2 years, so they can kind of veto it for 2 years and really delay a bill. But after then, the House of Commons can decide to invoke the Parliaments Act and pass it over their veto. And then this was strengthened in 1949 as this delaying power was reduced to 1 year. And as I said, these acts increased the power of the House of Commons in comparison to the House of Lords, and therefore increased the democratisation of the UK Constitution. The next key document is the 1972 European Communities Act. So this was the key act that confirmed the UK's entrance to the European Economic Community, which later morphed into the European Union. And crucially, it included the principle that EU law would take precedence over UK law where a conflict occurred. So this was important in harming parliamentary sovereignty, as there was a body that could strike down laws passed by Parliament in relation to EU law. And then the final one, kind of going against that, or kind of the most recent one, is the 2020 UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement. And this act removed the UK from the European Union, and therefore once more increased the sovereignty of Parliament and the power of the UK Parliament, because its laws could no longer be struck down in relation to EU law. So yeah, they're the key kind of 7 historical documents. And overall, these key documents developed the UK Constitution in the following ways, as I kind of said. So they reduced the power of the monarch and extended the power of Parliament, increasing parliamentary sovereignty. They increased the rights and freedoms of citizens. They drew together the component parts of the UK and centralised power in the UK Parliament. They increased the power of the House of Commons at the expense of the House of Lords. So you see that democratisation. And they defined the relationship with institutions which later evolved into the EU. So first joining the European Economic Community, and then in 2020 leaving the EU. Crucially, this development of the UK Constitution was very unique. And this is because the UK hasn't undergone a fundamental transformative change, such as a revolution or achieving independence, for a long period. And instead, the political system has evolved gradually without dramatic breaks in continuity, at least since the Civil War in the 17th century. And this contrasts with the US, where the Constitution was drawn up by the founders in 1787 after establishing independence from Britain. So in comparison to the US, Britain hasn't had a point where the kind of key politicians or everyone got together and wrote a constitution, right? It's developed gradually, and that kind of really explains the nature of it as well, why it's uncodified, why it's flexible, why it's unentrenched, as you haven't, and it's why it's kind of all in lots of different places, right? There wasn't kind of this one point of kind of after a revolution or a point of independence potentially, where everyone got together and wrote a constitution for the country. Rather, it's kind of developed gradually and kind of organically. And as I said, this gradual development is really important to understanding why the UK Constitution is uncodified and unentrenched. So yeah, that's it in terms of the historical development of the UK Constitution. What I'm going to look at now is the 5 main sources of the UK Constitution. So we've talked about the kind of nature of the Constitution. Now we're going to talk about kind of where is the Constitution, right? So as I said, the UK Constitution isn't codified in one single document like in the US, but it's contained in a number of different sources, including the 5 sources below, which are the most important ones. So the first one of these I'm going to look at is treaties. So treaties are agreements that the UK has signed with other states, and is therefore bound by they're kind of bound to follow international law. As they're written down and the UK is unlikely to renege on its international obligations, they make the UK constitution partly codified and more entrenched. This was especially the case when the UK was a member of the EU, as EU treaties took precedence over UK statute laws passed by Parliament. In terms of some examples, the UK signed the European Convention on Human Rights in 1951, which means that individuals and bodies in the UK are bound to follow the convention and can be held to account by the European Court of Human Rights, which isn't part of the EU, crucially. It's important to recognise, even though it has European in its name. Another example of a treaty is kind of what I just said, the 2020 UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement, which established the terms of the UK's exit from the EU, so confirmed it and established on what basis there was that exit, including many provisions for the new relationship, such as customs and VAT procedures. So that's treaties. They're a key kind of part of it that is written down. Another key part of the constitution that is written down is statute law. So statute law is the body of law passed by Parliament. So many of these laws aren't constitutional, only those that affect the political system and citizens' rights and kind of are pertaining to politics generally in the constitution are constitutional. It is the most important source of the UK constitution and includes most parts of it. Because statute laws only require a simple majority in Parliament and can be easily introduced, changed and removed, they make the UK constitution flexible and easy to change, as there's no need for supermajorities to change the constitution as there is in the US, for example. On the one hand, this flexibility can be seen as a positive because it allows for public opinion to be reflected and kind of allows for changes to the constitution at times of crisis, and very quick changes, and in relation to changing context. On the other hand, it can be seen as negative, as it could allow a tyrannical government to easily change the constitution in its favour. Some examples I've got here are the 1969 Representation of the People's Act, which lowered the voting age to 18, the Parliaments Acts of 1911 and 1914, of 1949, which is, as I said, limited the power of the House of Lords. The Human Rights Act is also a statute law, and the Scotland Act and Government of Wales Act, both of which were passed in 1998, introduced devolution in Scotland and Wales, respectively. So that shows how these big constitutional changes in the UK are just passed by simple statute laws. The third type of source of the constitution I'm going to look at is authoritative texts. So authoritative texts are books that explain the workings of the British political system. So they're a useful guide and do help to shape the political and constitutional landscape and how politicians behave. But ultimately, they're not binding and can't be enforced by law. So an example is that kind of, we talked about A.B. Dicey, right? An example is that kind of study he did in 1885, which set out that parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law were the twin pillars of the UK constitution. So there hasn't been like a statute law or a treaty passed to say this, but his kind of work has been really influential in setting up the UK constitution and helping people understand it. And kind of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty is then used by the courts, for example, and the Supreme Court as a way to understand what the UK constitution should be. The fourth thing I'm going to look at is common law. So common law is legal principles that are laid down by judges in their rulings on court cases, which then provide precedents for later judgments. These are often clarifications on the exact implementation of statute laws passed by Parliament. And they're really important. Common law is really important in cases where it isn't clear how statute laws should be applied. On the one hand, it arguably makes it more difficult to enforce the law and makes it less clear, while some argue that it is in effect judge-made law and therefore gives too much power to unelected judges rather than politicians. A good example of this is the presumption that a person accused of a crime is innocent until proven guilty. So this was common law for centuries before it became statute law in 1679. The final kind of source of the constitution we're going to look at are conventions. So conventions are customs and practices about how the government should behave that don't have legal force but have been broadly accepted over time. So crucially, these aren't written down. They can be challenged and changed by statute law. A key consequence of them is that they mean that the constitution is weak and relies upon respect for political institutions, especially from the government, which makes the constitution difficult to enforce and fragile if populism succeeded. They can, however, help to quickly avert crises and lead to quite a bit of flexibility in the UK constitution. Constitutional conflicts often arise when the assumptions on which a convention is based change. So, for example, the Salisbury Convention, which is that the House of Lords doesn't block anything in the government's manifesto. So, in terms of the assumptions this was based on, it could be argued that this was based on the principle that the Tories had a majority in the House of Lords and therefore shouldn't be able to block anything that the government, like a Labour government in a manifesto, wanted to pass. Therefore, since the 1999 House of Lords Act, it could be argued that this convention no longer applied because this removed the Commons' the Tory majority in the House of Lords. On the other hand, however, others argue that the Salisbury Convention is based on the House of Lords being unelected and therefore should still apply. So, if these kind of assumptions on which conventions are based change, then there could be kind of key constitutional conflicts as to whether these conventions should still apply. Ultimately, the test of whether a convention still applies is arguably the level of backlash that occurs when they're broken, either backlash in the House of Commons or among the public. Conventions can therefore be seen as changing with political circumstances, which on the one hand can be seen as a good thing, right? You have that flexibility. On the other hand, can be seen as a bad thing because constitution can be kind of easily changed and exploited. In terms of examples, individual ministerial responsibility holds that ministers should resign over serious mistakes in their department. That's not a statute law or anything in the constitution. It's kind of in the cabinet manual, which is set out by the prime minister at the start of every government. But ultimately, it's a convention. There's nothing kind of really holding anyone to account to follow it. It's also a convention that the monarch will always give royal assent to an act passed by Parliament. The last time this wasn't granted was in 1707. So that's a really key part of the constitution, right? The idea that the monarch just passed what Parliament says and the monarch plays very little political role. But that's ultimately a convention. There's no kind of written down part of the constitution that confirms that or kind of holds that to account. And then a more recent one is the use of referendums to decide key constitutional issues. So this is especially in the last 2 or 3 decades. In the devolution referendums, the AV referendum, Scottish independence referendum, and 2016 EU referendum, where these are all key constitutional issues, and it's kind of largely agreed upon that in order to make big changes to the constitution, you need to have a referendum. But that ultimately, there's no kind of law setting out when referendums have to be held. Ultimately, it's just a convention. So it could not be followed in the future if a prime minister decided not to. And as I said, with kind of the test if conventions still apply, it would be based on the backlash that would occur to that. To test if that happened, to test whether that convention is still in place. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the key sources of the constitution. Just going to finally wrap up by looking at some recent developments and key kind of constitutional issues. So one kind of recent development that could be noted is a decrease in parliamentary sovereignty. So we'll look at this more when we look at kind of the sovereignty topic and kind of other topics as well, including the Supreme Court. But in the last few decades, there have been a number of developments that could be argued to have decreased the sovereignty of Parliament. So when the UK was a member of the EU, parliamentary sovereignty was certainly decreased as EU law was higher law, and the European Court of Justice could strike down laws passed by Parliament. Devolution introduced other key lawmaking bodies in the UK, and though in legal terms they could be abolished by the UK Parliament, politically this would be very unlikely and difficult, and therefore it can be seen as moving away from that parliamentary sovereignty as centralisation of power in the UK Parliament. And then also the Human Rights Act gives judges the power to review legislation passed by Parliament and declare it incompatible with the Act. We'll look at that in a lot more detail in the kind of Supreme Court video and in the Rights Context video. And though Parliament could legally and theoretically reverse many of these, it's near politically impossible. And whilst there is an argument that devolution, and there's also an argument that devolution can't even be reversed legally. Therefore, it can be argued that the sovereignty of Parliament has really decreased in recent decades. Kind of a key constitutional expert, Vernon Bognador, kind of supported this and said that parliamentary sovereignty remains in form but not in substance. In practice, therefore, if not in law, parliamentary sovereignty is no longer the governing principle of the British Constitution. And this case has perhaps decreased though since the UK left the EU. It's kind of this was written before the UK left the EU, and kind of the UK leaving the EU once again strengthened parliamentary sovereignty somewhat. Final thing I'm going to look at is the 2019 prorogation of Parliament court case, and this is based around the fact that in 2019 Boris Johnson and his government prorogued, just temporarily suspended Parliament. And Johnson and the government argued this prorogation was a routine one that ordinarily follows the selection of a new Prime Minister. Critics, on the other hand, argued that the prorogation was intended to avoid parliamentary scrutiny of the government's Brexit plans and to make it harder for Parliament to block a no-deal Brexit. Ultimately, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the prorogation was unlawful, reversing the prorogation and reinstating Parliament. The Supreme Court noted that the sovereignty of Parliament would be undermined as the foundational principle of our Constitution, and if a prerogative power, could be used to prorogue, if a prerogative power to prorogue Parliament, could be used to prevent Parliament from exercising its legislative authority. This kind of really cited the kind of accountability of the executive to Parliament as a key constitutional principle and part of parliamentary sovereignty. So this can be seen as having introduced or kind of semi-codified a new key constitutional principle, which was the accountability of the executive to Parliament, which hadn't been kind of set out in kind of such detail or certainty before. So yeah, that's everything in terms of the content for this topic. As I said at the start of the video, it's unlikely that there will be kind of an essay question just about this content alone, but these concepts are highly, highly important to be able to answer questions that incorporate this topic and other topics, such as should the Constitution be codified, is Parliament still sovereign, and is the UK now effectively a federal system? So talking about that kind of move away from the Constitution being unitary to more of a union state, or kind of a quasi-federal system. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. Thank you very much for watching. Leave any kind of questions or comments in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. And yeah, if you're interested in tutoring or other help with your Politics A-level, go to the Politics Explained website where there's kind of essay plans, essays, and a place to sign up for tutoring. And also hopefully see some group classes as well over Easter. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.